What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
Do you know what people really think about you? I thought I did, because when it came to my family, I assumed the jokes, the little digs, the running comments were harmless and that we were all in this together. But it turns out I was funding the tradition while being the punchline in the background. And once I saw it written out, I could not unsee it. For years, every December played out the same way. We would get together, we would talk about plans, and when the moment came to pay, I would reach for my card before anyone else even pretended to. It was easier that way, less awkward, no squabbling over split checks or someone sighing about Venmo limits. At first, it honestly felt like a small price to pay for peace, because we had enough tension in other areas, and the holidays were supposed to be about keeping things light. My sister Megan would throw in a line about how grateful she was, my brother Ryan would make a half joke about paying me back next time, and my mom would give me that look that meant, "Thank you for holding it together," so I played the role. I had a stable job, I was single, I had fewer financial commitments, and I convinced myself that it was fine, that it was even generous of me to take care of it. But over time, I noticed the pattern getting heavier, like a snowball rolling downhill, except instead of snow it was dinners, hotel blocks, rental cars, and last-minute toy orders for nieces and nephews whose parents forgot. The running total in my head became impossible to ignore, but I kept swallowing it down, because I thought the alternative was worse: fights, resentment, that awful kind of silence that ruins family gatherings. It felt easier to eat the cost than to ruin the mood. I remember one Christmas where Ryan was late with his flight booking, so I paid the fee to switch his ticket because he swore the system was about to boot him off. Another year, Megan's daughter wanted a particular toy that had sold out everywhere except a reseller charging triple, and somehow it ended up on my card, wrapped under their tree, and my sister smiled like it was a miracle from Santa. Even the restaurant tabs, where I would quietly cover the tip because someone would forget cash every time I stepped in, and every time, it was smoothed over with some line about how I was just good with money, or how I earned more, or how I could handle it because I didn't have daycare bills draining me. And I told myself it was fine, but I'll admit it, every year I started dreading the moment the bill came, because it was like a play with the same ending. I was cast as the reliable one, the easy solution, the person who never complained. And then, just a few weeks before this last Christmas, I found out what they actually thought about me, and that changed everything. It was stupid, the way it happened. My cousin sent a screenshot of a meme to what she thought was the main family chat, but she slipped up and added me to the wrong thread by mistake. I opened it absent-mindedly, and there it was, a private group called Holiday Parasite. The name alone made my stomach drop, and when I scrolled, it only got worse. Lines like, "She'll pick it up anyway," "She always does," or "Let her get the points," "She loves it," and then Kyle, my brother-in-law, adding, "She thinks she's the hero, let her swipe." It wasn't just one or two offhand jokes, it was years of screenshots of bills, photos of receipts, jokes about me being the designated pair. They had planned around me without even asking, and they thought it was funny. My first instinct was to confront them, to blow it up right there, but something in me went quiet instead. I just stared at that chat for a long time, scrolled up and down, and realized that if I exploded, they would spin it into me overreacting. That was the playbook: keep it light, make me look uptight, then I'd back off and pay anyway. So I didn't say anything. Not one word. Instead, I opened my banking app that night and went through every single recurring transfer I had set up for Christmas: the hotel block deposit, the automatic contribution I had been making to Mom's holiday fund that somehow never matched receipts, the restaurant prepayment I had already put down. I canceled them all. One by one, I hit cancel transfer, and when the app asked if I was sure, I clicked yes, without hesitation. Then I went into my settings and removed my card from anything connected to the family calendar or shared accounts. And for the first time in years, I felt calm. Not triumphant, not smug, just calm. I realized I didn't have to tell them. I didn't have to argue. I could just stop funding the joke. And if they wanted to talk about parasites, they could face a bill without me. I didn't sleep much that night because my head was spinning with the thought that the pattern had been obvious all along and I had let it happen. I thought I was being the peacemaker, the strong one, but maybe I was just too afraid to see how little respect they had for me. And now I had proof. Screenshots don't lie. The next morning, I looked at those receipts in my email, years of charges, and I whispered to myself, I won't be the punchline anymore. I didn't send the chat back, I didn't tip my hand, I didn't warn them. I just built my own quiet file, because I knew Christmas was coming, and when the bill showed up, the Parasite wasn't going to play along. I didn't argue. I exported receipts. When I woke up the next day with that quiet file sitting in my inbox like a mirror I could no longer avoid, I decided that if I was going to stop paying to be liked, then I had to replace the old habit with a new rule that did not need my emotions to hold it up. So I made coffee, opened a clean note, and wrote a simple line that I could read back to myself whenever the guilt started to hum in my chest. Everyone pays what they owe before we eat, and if someone does not pay, then we simply do not eat together on that person's tab, and there will be no speeches, no fights, no shaming, just policy. I took a breath, opened the family thread that we use for logistics more than feelings, and typed a message that was boring on purpose, because I did not want drama, I wanted clarity. So I wrote that the restaurant had asked for a per-person deposit to hold our table, that the total was broken down by head count, that I had asked the manager for separate checks at the table so no one would be surprised, and that all deposits needed to be in by the end of the week or the seats would be released. And then I pasted the payment link with each person's portion already calculated, so all they had to do was tap and be done. Within minutes the scores started to play their usual music, with Ryan sending a string of jokes about me charging admin fees, like I was a bank, and Kyle dropping a meme about someone scanning a barcode straight into their soul. And Megan chiming in with the familiar line that she would settle up on the night because payday was cutting it close, while Mom texted me privately to ask if this could be handled without making money the headline because she hated the feeling that we were nickel and diming each other during the holidays, and in that moment I understood how the old script kept winning, because they always framed my boundaries as rudeness, while their assumptions about my wallet were presented as family warmth. So I stayed calm, and I wrote back in the main thread that nothing had changed except the part where I was no longer floating the deposit, that separate checks protected everyone from surprises, that the deposit would be credited back to each person's bill, and that the restaurant policy was not up for debate. And when Mom wrote me again to say she just wanted peace, I told her, in a slow and steady voice that surprised even me, that peace without fairness is just silence, and I was done buying that kind of peace. To make the policy real and not just a line in a chat, I called the restaurant manager, a woman who sounded like she had seen every version of holiday chaos and had zero interest in adding more. And I asked her to switch the booking from one big bill to separate checks, to attach a unique deposit linked to each guest name, and to set an automatic release on any unpaid seat the moment the deadline hit. And she said that would be easy and honestly a relief, because big groups who argue at the table ruin everyone else's night. And after we confirmed the details, I paid the deposits for my parents and for myself, then sent the rest of the links to the thread so the freeloaders could either step up or sit it out. Dad responded first with a screenshot of his confirmation and a short note that said done, which, in frank language, is the equivalent of a speech and a standing ovation. Then a cousin paid, then another cousin paid. And what stood out to me was how the people who never made a scene handled it quietly and quickly, while the loudest voices stayed loud and somehow did nothing, because hours later Ryan still wrote, "I got you on Friday." Carl wrote that the link was not working even though everyone else's had gone through, and Megan wrote that she would figure it out by the weekend, and that I should not stress, because we always make it work in the end. I did not reply with the screenshots of the private chat, and I did not remind them of the years where "we make it work" meant I covered the gap, and they called it a family miracle, because I wanted the new rule to stand on its own legs. So instead I sent each of them a direct payment request with the memo line set to their name, their seat, and the deadline, and I turned on the feature that auto-cancels the request if it is not accepted by the time the restaurant needs the headcount, which meant that for once the clock was not running on my patience, it was running on a policy they could not charm. Mom called again that evening to test the temperature and asked whether there was any way to keep things less transactional, and I told her as gently as I could that the only reason this felt transactional now was because the transactions had always been there. They had just been hidden under my card, and that I respected her wish for harmony, but I was not willing to finance it anymore, and to my surprise, she took a long breath and said she understood more than I thought, that she had seen me step in 100 times and had worried that I was becoming the default without anyone saying thank you out loud, and I realized she had been swallowing her own frustration to keep the machine running. By the end of the week, 3 people had paid within an hour of the first message. 2 more followed after the direct requests. Dad had been first, Mom had mine and hers covered in full, and the 3 loudest voices had not moved at all. Which meant that when the deadline struck, the system would kick them off the reservation without any speech from me, and I will admit there was a moment when I almost texted a reminder because I am conditioned to save the day, but I did not, because the day was not in danger, just the entitlement was. When the clock finally rolled over and the manager sent me the updated headcount with the unpaid seats released to the waitlist, I felt a wave of relief so clean it was almost dizzying, not because anyone had suffered, but because the consequence matched the choice with no screaming, no guilt, and no secret subsidy from my pocket, and while the thread stayed strangely quiet for a few hours, I knew the silence had a cost that was landing where it belonged for once, which is probably why I slept well that night for the first time in a long time, knowing that I had not lectured, I had not shamed, I had not tattled, I had simply let the receipts talk in my place, and they were fluent. By the time the deposit deadline flipped from theory to consequence and the manager sent that neat little headcount with the unpaid seats released to the waitlist, I realized that I had finally built a wall between their habits and my wallet that did not require a confrontation to hold it up, yet as clean as that felt, I could also feel the old reflex rising in me. The one that wants to apologize in advance for other people's choices and smooth the edges that they keep sharpening, so I decided that before anyone tried to pull me back into the script where I play the patient accountant with the magic card, I would let facts, timestamps, and the words they had written about me do the only kind of talking that actually changes behavior. I sat at my desk with my inbox open and pulled up the chain of confirmations from the restaurant, the canceled transfers from my bank, and the rejected payment requests that expired exactly when I said they would. And as I scrolled, I understood something I should have grasped years ago, which is that people who depend on your silence will always accuse you of being loud the moment you say anything at all, which is why I was not going to say much. I was simply going to show. Then step out of the room and let the echo bounce without me. I saved the receipts as a tidy set of screenshots with clear labels, not because I wanted to humiliate anyone, but because the minute you leave things vague, someone will invent a story that fits their comfort. And I am done giving comfort to people who confuse me paying the bill with love, and while I worked, the other thread, the one I was never supposed to see, kept pulsing in my head like a bruise, especially the part where Kyle called me the family tap, and Ryan wrote that I should get platinum status for codependent spending, and Megan, who always hides her sharpness inside soft words, wrote that I like being needed, which felt like a compliment until you remember it was her excuse for assuming I would keep rescuing her from her own calendar. I took a last thorough scroll through that holiday Parasite chat, and instead of forwarding the worst lines like some dramatic prosecuting attorney, I captured the most undeniable piece, which was the title itself sitting above their names like a header they chose together, and I stared at it long enough to let the heat pass, because I wanted to move with a steady hand, not with shaking fingers that type words I will regret. And when the heat was gone, I made my move with the same calm I used to make reservations. In the main family thread, without commentary and without a single adjective that could be argued with, I dropped 3 things. First, the screenshot of the canceled transfers where my bank literally shows the word canceled, with dates lined up next to the manager's emails so no one could pretend the sequence was vague. Second, the list of expired payment requests with each name next to the note that said auto-canceled on deadline, which a child could understand. And third, the updated Reservation confirmation that showed a smaller table for the people who had actually paid, including my parents and me, which meant the plan was not ruined, it was simply resized to reality. Then, after a breath that felt like the last 5 years leaving my body, I sent a fourth image that required no explanation, a single screenshot of the private chat's title with the words, Holiday Parasite, at the top and their first names visible in the participant row, and I typed one sentence beneath it that did not ask a question or invite a debate. I will not be covering anything this year, and if you want a seat, the manager can put you on the wait list like everyone else. I stared at that one sentence, checked it for any emotional leakage, and when I was sure it was clean, I hit send and did the most radical thing I have ever done in my family, which was nothing, because I powered down my phone, folded the case shut, and went for a long, ordinary walk with no soundtrack except my own breathing, and while my mind tried its best to imagine the incoming fireworks, Mom's soft pleading, Megan's defensive lecture about timing, Ryan's sarcasm, Kyle's smirking passive aggression dressed as logic, I kept reminding myself that silence is not surrender if you have already put the facts on the table. It is simply refusing to audition for a role you did not choose. Hours later, when I finally turned the phone back on, the thread lit up exactly the way you would expect when a group of adults collide with the bill they have avoided. And it was a cascade of messages that alternated between accusations that I had ambushed them and demands that I take down the screenshot because it was out of context, with Mom begging for a call, Megan insisting the chat was just dark humor, Ryan announcing he would have paid if I had not made it so formal, and Kyle attempting a lawyerly tone about privacy, which would have been funnier if the title of the chat did not make his point for me, and in the middle of that noise there was one short message from Dad that cut through like a bell. I saw enough. Send me the totals from the past few years. Seeing that line from him grounded me in a way I did not know I needed, because it reminded me that fairness does not have to shout to be real, and I answered him privately with a promise to send a simple summary with dates and amounts. But before I did anything else in the main thread, I typed a final line that would be my last comment for the night, which said that I would not debate screenshots of their own words, that the reservation had been updated to match the payments received, and that any additions would have to go through the restaurant like every other adult trying to get a table on a holiday week, and then I set the thread to mute, because if they wanted a fight they would have to have it without me. I put the phone face down again, felt the house go quiet, and understood that the cost of this silence would be real, because there would be fallout and there would be stories told about me at tables I did not join. Yet for the first time I did not feel afraid of that, because the receipts were finally doing the work my nerves had been doing for years, and if anyone needed clarity, the calendar, the bank, and the reservation system had already spoken, which meant that what came next would not be measured in apologies or decibels, but in who shows up like a grown-up and who does not, and as that thought settled, I realized the night was not ending a chapter so much as setting the stage for the conversation I had avoided my entire adult life. The one where I stop being useful and start being respected, and I knew exactly who I would speak to first in the morning, because he had asked for the truth and meant it. When I finally picked up the phone the next morning and opened the muted thread, I saw exactly what I had expected. Yet reading it in real time rather than imagining it on my walk the night before still hit with that sharp combination of exhaustion and disbelief that only family can provoke, because there it was. An avalanche of messages written with the kind of frantic energy people have when they know the mirror is being held too close, and they will say anything, absolutely anything, to fog it over before they are forced to really look. Megan had written a 3-paragraph explanation about how the holiday parasite chat was just dark humor that had gotten out of hand, and that no one really meant it, that it was basically an inside joke that was never supposed to reach me, and that I was blowing things out of proportion by treating it like a binding statement instead of a silly little release valve. But what she did not say, and what I could not stop hearing between the lines, was that if the joke had always depended on me not knowing, then it was never harmless to begin with. It was strategy disguised as laughter. Ryan's contributions were their own genre, an endless parade of sarcastic jabs dressed up as humor, with him insisting that I had turned into the fun police for daring to send bank screenshots, and that if I had just trusted him he would have paid. which made me laugh out loud, not because it was funny, but because there was something so absurd about watching someone who has dodged every bill for years suddenly claim the moral high ground of "I was about to," and when I typed out the words, "Receipts don't care about to," I stopped myself and deleted them, because I had promised myself this time the facts, not my sarcasm, would do the talking. Kyle, of course, went with his favorite costume, which was the self-appointed lawyer of the group, lecturing me about privacy violations and context manipulation, saying that dropping a screenshot of a private chat into the main thread was crossing a line, as though the real betrayal was my decision to hold up the mirror rather than their decision to create the chat in the first place. And when he tried to argue that the word parasite had not been meant literally but as a playful exaggeration, I felt the kind of cold clarity that only comes when you realize someone would rather insult your intelligence than admit the obvious, and that clarity made me grateful for my choice to power down the night before, because silence was still my sharpest tool. Mom's messages broke my heart more than they angered me, because every one of them was a plea for peace, written in the soft rhythm of someone who cannot stand the sound of conflict in her house, and while part of me wanted to bend toward her comfort, the larger part of me had to remind myself that peace without fairness is a lie we all had been buying for years, and if I caved now just because she hated tension, then nothing would ever change, and I would find myself right back at the same table next year, card in hand, pretending not to hear the jokes that would only grow meaner with time. And then there was Dad, who had sent exactly 4 words the night before I saw enough totals. And those words had carried more weight than everything else combined, because they were neither defensive nor sarcastic, neither guilt-driven nor lawyerly, but simply the question of a man who believed in numbers over noise, and when I read them again I felt steadier. Because I knew that whatever chaos erupted in the thread, he was going to listen if I showed him the facts, so I opened a blank spreadsheet, pulled up 5 years of holiday charges, and started building the kind of document one could spin away with jokes or excuses. Line by line I added the dinners, the hotels, the deposits, the toy orders, the flights, the tips, each one matched with the card statement that proved who had paid and who had not, and, by the time I finished, even I was shocked at the total. Because the quiet generosity I had been framing as helping out here and there had added up to a number that could have paid for a brand new car or a full year's rent in some cities, and suddenly the word parasite was no longer just ugly, it was accurate, because parasites thrive when the host convinces herself that feeding them is love. I sent the file privately to Dad first, not because I wanted to make it secretive, but because I trusted him to look at it with clear eyes before the noise started again, and within 10 minutes he wrote back a single line that said, "Thank you for keeping this," which to anyone else would look like nothing but to me felt like a floodgate cracking open, because I realized he had noticed all along and had simply chosen silence rather than step into the fights Mom tried so hard to avoid. Only then did I send the same file to the main thread, attaching it with a short message that said the following: "This is 5 years of holiday costs, documented with statements, matched against who paid and who did not. This is not up for debate, it is math. If anyone wants to claim otherwise, please attach your own receipts." I did not add a single insult or editorial, because the file spoke louder than anything else I could write, and as soon as it landed, the thread went dead quiet, which was the clearest echo of all, because when people who are usually loud suddenly stop, it means the facts have reached them in a way words never could. Meanwhile, I called the restaurant and asked to reduce the table from the original size to just the number of people who had fully paid, thanked the manager for her patience, and then made a second booking at a different place for the following day. A smaller lunch just for my parents and me, because I realized they deserved to celebrate without the tension and without the performance, and I wanted at least one holiday memory that year where no one was keeping a running tally in the back of their head except me, and this time the tally was 0. The group thread eventually sputtered back to life with a few vague promises that they would handle it themselves and that I did not need to make it personal, which I found almost funny, because the only reason I had built the file was to show that it had been personal for me every single year when I quietly paid, but I resisted the temptation to clap back, because sometimes silence is not weakness, but strategy. And I knew they were hearing their own echo now, the sound of years of entitlement bouncing back without my cushioning, and I did not need to add another word to make the point stick. So when I muted the thread again that night, I did it not out of fear or fatigue, but out of the calm recognition that the reservation had been updated, the receipts had been filed, and the next move was no longer mine to make. Which was the most satisfying part of all, because for once I was not waiting for their gratitude, their excuses, or their laughter. I was waiting to enjoy a quiet meal with two people who had actually paid their share. And the echo of that truth was louder than any argument could ever be. When Christmas finally arrived, the fallout that had been brewing all week landed exactly as I expected, not with a single explosion, but with a string of awkward collisions that played out in different corners. Each one reminding me that people who depend on you to hold the weight rarely learn how to carry their own until the ground tilts beneath them, and this year the ground was tilting hard. The table that had once been a sprawling production full of forced laughter and side conversations was now smaller, tighter, and occupied only by the people who had actually confirmed their spots with deposits, which meant my parents and a couple of extended relatives who had quietly done what was asked without turning it into theater, and the absence of the others spoke louder than if they had shown up with their usual excuses, because it revealed the simple truth that without someone underwriting their presence, they had no real intention of paying for it themselves. I later heard from the restaurant manager that Ryan, Megan, and Kyle did show up at the original time, walking in with the same confidence of people who believe rules will bend if they just smile wide enough, only to be told by staff that the table was already occupied and that their names were not on the list, and apparently there was a back and forth where they insisted there must be a mistake. But the staff simply pointed to the system, which showed no deposit and no reservation under their names, and eventually they had to leave, frustrated and embarrassed, with Ryan muttering something about family betrayal, while Kyle tried to intimidate the manager with his fake legal tone. A scene I would have almost enjoyed witnessing had I not been busy sitting in a quiet booth across town with my parents, eating food that tasted better simply because no one at the table was pretending. That lunch with Mom and Dad became the reset I had needed for years, but never admitted out loud, because while Mom did her best to keep her voice soft and her questions careful, asking whether I was sure I had not gone too far, Dad raised his glass halfway through the meal and said, to grown-up choices, which was his way of saying that he had been waiting for this line to be drawn, and was relieved that I had finally done it. For once, there was no hidden bill waiting to appear, no sudden calculation of who owed what, no sense that I had to be the safety net. It was simply three people enjoying a meal, each of them covered fairly. And it felt almost revolutionary to realize how much lighter the holiday became when fairness replaced obligation. Of course, the silence did not last forever, because the phone eventually buzzed with calls and messages that I could not ignore completely, and the first came from Megan, who swung between anger and tears, saying that I had humiliated her in front of the whole family, that I had taken things public when they could have been handled quietly, that I had embarrassed her husband by exposing the chat, and that I had ruined the holiday over what she kept calling a joke gone wrong. I listened longer than I should have, biting back the urge to match her emotion with my own, and when she finally paused, I told her in a voice that surprised even me with its steadiness that I was not responsible for how she felt about her own choices, and that from now on, if she wanted to join a meal, she would pay what she owed before she sat down, and that there would be no exceptions, no rescue, no miracle swipes of my card. She hung up in frustration, and for once I did not feel the need to call back. Later that evening, Ryan left me a voicemail full of sarcasm about how I had turned Christmas into a business transaction, and I smiled at the irony. Because for years he had been the one treating me like his personal credit line while claiming family should never keep score, and now that the receipts were out in the open, he was the one crying foul about accountability. Kyle, predictably, sent me a half apology dressed up as a lecture, claiming that he was sorry if the chat had hurt my feelings, but that I should have addressed it privately rather than airing it out in the main thread. As though the real crime had been my transparency rather than their entitlement, and I marked his message as read without replying, because I finally understood that engaging with people who dodge accountability only pulls you back into the game they know how to play. And I was no longer playing. The most important part, though, was the quiet decision I made in the days that followed, which was to set up a standing rule that would outlive the heat of this particular holiday. Because I did not want to rely on my own discipline or memory to enforce it next year when emotions inevitably soften and nostalgia starts whispering about giving them just one more chance. So I created a shared digital folder titled Future Holidays Read First and placed inside it the spreadsheet with 5 years of expenses, the screenshots of the holiday Parasite chat, the restaurant confirmations, and the single policy line that stated, all costs are split up front with receipts, deposits are paid directly by each person, and any unpaid seats will be released automatically, no exceptions. That way, the rule was no longer about my mood or my willingness to fight. It was written, saved, and accessible, a permanent record that could not be argued with or forgotten. To close the loop in my own way, I also did something that might sound small, but felt important. I sent a dessert platter to the restaurant staff with a thank you note signed only with my first name, because they had handled the chaos with patience and professionalism when my family tried to argue their way into a table they had not earned, and while I was done covering for people who mocked me, I still believed in recognizing those who did their jobs fairly and without complaint. That act reminded me that generosity feels best when it is directed at people who do not expect it, not at people who treat it as their due. As the holiday weekend closed, I realized that my victory was not about punishing anyone, even though part of me had enjoyed the poetic justice of them being turned away at the door. It was about changing the rules permanently so that my value was no longer measured by how much I paid to keep other people comfortable, but by the worth I claimed when I stopped funding their entitlement. For the first time in years, I ended Christmas without resentment, without that bitter aftertaste of being laughed at behind my back, and with the quiet knowledge that I had not just won a single fight, but had shifted the entire structure of how we would gather moving forward. When I looked again at the unread message from Kyle, the one where he tried to half apologize and half justify, I felt no anger, no urge to fire back, just a calm certainty that I did not owe him a single reply, because my silence was louder than anything I could type. I knew he and the others would either adapt to the new system or opt out, and either way the outcome worked for me, because the days of paying to be the family punchline were over, and the brilliance of it all was that I had not needed to shout, argue, or seek approval. I had simply let the receipts, the policy, and the consequences speak on my behalf. And that, in the end, was the clearest lesson of all. My worth was never tied to the price of a meal or the balance of a credit card. My worth came from refusing to play the role they had written for me, from drawing the line and keeping it steady, and from realizing that sometimes the most powerful revenge is not fire or fury, but the quiet elegance of walking away with your dignity intact, leaving them to sit with the echo of their own words.